Good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Mr. Wilkinson.
Good evening.
I'm going to have to step away for an hour at 7.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello, anybody home?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, how's everybody?
I'm fine. Did you hear me say I'm stepping away for an hour at 7?
1 hour at 7.
Yes.
Doggone it. Does that mean you'll be back exactly 8 o'clock
Yes,
or
sir.
before?
Exactly.
Okay. I'm assuming it is a very critical situation.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's quite understandable. As soon as you've done what you've done, please come back and join us. Tonight is our discussion night, our final night of lecture, and talk about um, final exam. So in about 30 minutes, Thea, if I'm not talking about the examination and all that stuff yet, please interrupt me so that I can update everybody while you're with us, so you don't
Okay.
miss that.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah. Thank you very much. All right, so while we wait for the others to come, why don't we just get right into our discussion for this evening. We'll start off with the OECD governance principles, if you can pull those notes up. Okay, does everybody have those notes? OECD governance principles?
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay, so we spent the last 3 weeks or so talking about all kinds of governance issues. Remember last week and the week before, we covered a whole lot of material about what is expected at the corporate level. And so now we're going to look at more governance, but this time from a slightly different perspective, from the OECD perspective, the guy up with this thing originally. And then for the second half of the evening, we'll get into some discussion about the governance from a financial services perspective in terms of what the Central Bank of the Bahamas expects of its licensees and financial institutions. Okay, so at the end of the day, we end up with a general perspective for all organizations in terms of governance, which we've covered already. Then we'll see the OECD's perspective for what they expect for governments around the world in terms of what they legislate and how they expect entities to run. And then finally, we'll end our discussions on the central bank's perspective with regards to its licensees and the government governance requirements in financial institutions. Okay. Does anybody have any questions before we begin? Okay. I have some things to say
Yes,
about.
so sorry, Mr. Wilkinson,
Yes.
if I may. I know we're dealing with the OECD principles, and I was just looking at the original emails that was sent us with some of the attachments.
Mm-hmm.
Will we, before the final exam, will we be getting into the central bank guidelines for corporate governance?
We will. I hope to do that in the second half of this lecture.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So for the first part of the evening, we'll talk a little bit about the OECD governance principles, and then we're going to get into the central bank side of things.
All right.
Yeah. So for the first 45 minutes or so, if you see me running on with the OECD people after 45 minutes, interrupt me and tell me, and I would agree with you. I think that's enough OECD stuff. Let's get into the Central Bank of the Bahamas stuff, okay? Because that's the plan for today. Absolutely. All right, so if you have your OECD notes in front of you, if you have it already or have taken a look at it, you'll see that basically the OECD, I'm assuming that we all know what OECD means. Does anybody not know who the OECD is? Can anybody say who the OECD is?
Is
Anybody?
that what the Organization of Eastern Caribbean Development States?
That's an interesting substitute. Uh,
It was a
I,
good.
I, I like that. I don't think I've heard that one for a long time, actually. But that's a good substitute. Kind of like the response if you get it in an exam and you can't remember. So you know what? I'm gonna come up with something. Maybe I'll still get credit. And I always encourage students to do that because sometimes you do. Okay. All right. Anybody else want to take a stab at who the OECD is?
I
What
can't
does OECD
remember the
mean?
C, but I know it's Organization for Economic Development.
Yes.
It's academic cooperation and development.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
cooperation, yeah.
Yes. The
I know.
Organization of Economic and Cooperative.
Man, Gia, Google it, man, Mr. Wilkinson.
No, sir,
Yeah.
I did not.
No, she said she did not. She remembered that bloody thing after you came up with that great substitute. She said, you know what? I remember this thing. So you helped her to remember. All right. So yeah, these are the original guys in Europe, as you may have recalled, who have teamed up with people like Fatih and all the other alphabet soup across Europe, originally to tell the world how they should deal with money laundering issues and terrorist financing issues, and now governance principle issues, and that if we don't institute these in our laws and our countries and so on, they're not going to like us anymore. They're going to cut us off from corresponding banking and make our lives pretty much a little miserable from an international perspective. So, for the moment, we are their slaves. We have to take note of what they say. Of course, the governance principles are not a bad thing. Um, we just hope that there's a level playing field somewhere, and what they're trying to tell the world to do, including the Bahamas, that hopefully they're doing it themselves over there in those bloody European countries. Right? Question? You know, human nature is a strange thing. We like to tell people what to do, but we don't necessarily like to do it. Okay? Hopefully that doesn't apply in the case of OECD governance principles. And again, remember the very definition of principles is to suggest what we ought to be doing. Principles are not designed normally to be prescriptive, like do A, B, C, tick the box. And if one of the boxes are not ticked, then you're not compliant. You just not getting your job done, you're fired. Kind of prescriptive program. Principles are not designed to be that way in general. And governance principles are very similar. When we get to the Central Bank of the Bahamas discussion, you'll see that some parts of the central bank requirements are prescriptive. They tell you what they want, what they expect to see, what they expect financial institutions to have. And that's why I'm leaving that for the tail end of our discussion. But because by that time, we would have covered all the general perspectives of the principles of governance, including the OECD's perspective. And so when we get to the more prescriptive version by the central bank, we'll be able to put everything in some prescriptive perspective. God forbid. Okay, so I need a volunteer. Anybody feels like kicking things off for today?
I guess I can
No?
read seeing that I'm leaving.
Okay, that would be great. All right, so why don't you kick in then, Thea? Don't
This is
forget to
about,
interrupt me in about half an hour, Thea.
okay. This is about the principles. We're starting there.
Yes, OECD governance principles. The principles are right there.
Okay. The principles are intended to help policymakers evaluate and improve the legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for corporate governance with a view to support economic efficiency. 1 minute for me, please. Uh-huh. Okay, come.
Sorry, Mr. Wilkinson, we are reading from page 13?
Page 9.
Oh,
Okay, sorry about
Yeah,
that.
page 9, OECD governance principles. That's okay. Thea, how old is the little one again?
She's 4.
4.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's good because, when you get tired of her, you have my contacts. You have my email and you have my phone number. You can call and tell me you're tired of that little girl and I'll take her off your hands. The only problem is you can't get her back. Okay?
No, we can't trade that one. I'll trade one of the boys.
No. I have 2 grown sons. I don't want to see another dude for a while. So I'll take the girl if you're prepared to sign over the documents to me, because I'll be planning on miss this and miss that and the ponytails and the curls and all that stuff. And I don't want you to bother me once I get started. All right. So
No, that's my up and coming tennis star. That's okay. I'll hold on to
tennis
her.
dog on it. I like it already. All right, keep going.
Okay. The principles are intended to help policymakers evaluate, improve the legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for corporate governance with a view to support economic efficiency, sustainable growth, and financial stability. This is primarily achieved by providing shareholders, board members, and executives, as well as financial intermediaries and service providers with the right incentive to perform their roles within a framework of checks and balances.
So basically, the
The
principle is
principles,
let's all do the right thing. All right, and you'll see that playing through throughout this whole thing. Keep going.
the principles are intended to be concise, understandable, and accessible to the international community. On the basis of the principles, it is the role of government, semi-government, or private sector initiative to assess the quality of the corporate governance framework and develop more detailed mandatory or voluntary provisions that can take into account country-specific economic, legal, and cultural differences. The principles focus on publicly traded companies, both financial and non-financial. Okay, baby. To the extent they are deemed applicable. They might also be a useful tool to improve corporate governance in companies whose shares are not publicly traded. While some of the principles may be more appropriate for larger than for smaller companies, policymakers may wish to raise awareness of good corporate governance for all companies, including smaller and unlisted companies. Corporate governance involves a set of relationships between a company's management, its board, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. Corporate governance also provides the structure through which the objectives of the company are set and the means of attaining those objectives and monitoring performance are determined. The principles do not intend to prejudice or second guess the business judgment of individual market participants, board members, and company officials. What works in one company or for one group of investors may not necessarily be generally applicable to all business or of systemic economic importance. The principle recognizes the interests of employees and other stakeholders and their important role in contributing to the long-term success and performance of the company. Other factors relevant to a company's decision-making processes, such as environmental, anti-corruption, or ethical concerns, are considered in the principles but are treated more explicitly in a number of other instruments, including the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, which are referenced in
Hello, while we're on it, the ILO. We now know who the OECD is. Who's the ILO? Okay, just for general information, it's the International Labor Organization. and that's the international organization that governs or seeks to govern labor around the world. And they too come up with a set of principles about how labor should be managed around the world. Same basic idea that we're talking about with governance, that if you have child labor, that is not acceptable. If you're selling labor cheaply, that is not acceptable. If you're abusing labor, that is not acceptable. And these are the kinds of things that the International Labor Organization, of which the Bahamas is a member as well, and most other countries are governed by, similar to the governance requirements of the OECD. Okay, keep going.
The principles are developed with an understanding that corporate governance policies have an important role to play in achieving broader economic objectives with respect to investor confidence, capital formation, and allocation. The quality of corporate governance affects the cost for corporations to assess capital for growth and the confidence with which corporate those that provide capital directly or indirectly can participate and share in their value creation on fair and equitable terms. Together, the body of corporate governance rules and practices therefore provides a framework that helps to bridge the gap between house savings and investment in the real economy. As a consequence, good corporate governance will reassure shareholders and other stakeholders that their rights are protected and make it possible for corporations to decrease the cost of capital and to facilitate their access to the capital market.
In other words, what she's saying in all of that is that if a company's reputation is good because of good governance, then investors will trust that what the company says it is doing and will do, that they will, because they have a good reputation for good governance. And therefore, when companies try to raise money, which we refer to as capital, investors will be more inclined to invest in those companies. Similarly, if governance issues are in question, reputation is in a shambles, and companies try to raise money from investors internationally, then those investors are going to be wary. They're going to be reluctant to invest their money in those kinds of companies, which will make it difficult for those companies to get the capital they need to expand and to grow. And certainly, if not impossible, if they do get the money, they'll have to pay a very high price to get it from investors. Okay. And so we're just trying to show you all the different perspectives where governance impacts the long-term future of every type of company. That's the point. Keep going.
This is of significant importance in today's globalized capital markets. International flows of capital enable companies to access financing from a much larger pool of investors. If companies and countries are to reap the full benefits of the global capital market, and if they are, if companies and countries are to reap the full benefits of the global capital market, and if they are to attract long-term patient capital, corporate governance arrangements must be credible, well understood across borders, and adhere to internationally accepted principles.
Okay.
If corp, pardon me?
Keep going.
Even if corporations do not rely primarily on foreign sources of capital, a credible corporate governance framework supported by effective supervision and enforcement mechanisms will help improve the confidence of domestic investors, reduce the cost of capital, underpin the good functioning of financial markets, and ultimately reduce more stable sources of financing. There is no single model of good corporate governance. However, some common elements underlie good corporate governance. The principles build on these common elements and are formulated to embrace the different models that exist. For example, they do not advocate any particular board structure, and the term board as used in the principle is meant to embrace the different national models of board structures. In the typical two-tier system found in some countries, board as used in the principles refer to the supervisory board, while key executives refers to the management board. In systems where the unitary board is overseen by an international auditors body, the principles applicable to the board are also mutatis mutandis applicable. As
Has anybody
the
ever heard that
definition
expression?
of the term,
Sorry, Ms. Moss, has anybody ever heard that expression before? Mutatis mutandis? It's a legal
that's a legal
Latin
term?
expression, yes.
Does it mean one and the same or something like that?
Close, it means
No?
among other things, yes. Which sometimes suggests
Okay.
one and the same. Okay, good stuff. All right, keep going.
As the definition of the term key executive may vary among jurisdictions. Right. And depending on context, for example, remuneration, or related party transactions, the principle leave it to individual jurisdictions to define this term in a functional manner that meets the intended outcome of the principles. The terms corporation and company are used interchangeably in the text. The principles are non-binding and do not aim at detailed prescriptions for national legalization.
So it's for national,
Legislation, sorry.
keep going.
Rather, they seek to identify objectives and suggest various means for achieving them. The principles aim to provide a robust but flexible reference for policymakers and market participants to develop their own frameworks for corporate governance. To remain competitive in a changing world, corporations must innovate and adapt their corporate governance practices so that they can meet new opportunities. Taking into account the costs and benefits of regulation, governments have an important responsibility for shaping an effective regulatory framework that provides for sufficient flexibility to allow markets to function effectively and to respond to new expectations of shareholders and other stakeholders. The principles are widely used as a benchmark by individual jurisdictions around the world. They are also one of the Financial Stability Board's key standards for sound financial systems and provide the basis for assessment of the corporate governance component of the reports on the observance of standards and codes of the World Bank. The principles themselves are evolutionary in nature and are reviewed in light of significant changes in circumstances in order to maintain their role as a leading instrument for policymaking in the area of corporate governance. The principles are presented in 6 different chapters. 1, ensuring the basis for an effective corporate governance framework. 2, the right and equitable treatment of shareholders and key ownership functions. 3, institutional investors, stock markets, and other intermediaries. 4, the role of stakeholders. 5, disclosure and transparency. And 6, the responsibilities of the board. Each chapter is headed by a single principle that is followed by a number of supporting sub-principles. The principles are supplemented by annotations that contain commentary on the principles and are intended to readers understand their rationale. The annotations may also contain descriptions of dominant or emerging trends and offer alternative implementation methods and examples that may be useful in making the principles operational.
Thank you very much, Thea. Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction to the OECD principles. I'll talk a little bit in a few moments. 6 principles of corporate governance that are put forth by OECD. But notice some of the key language that is used in this OECD principle perspective. They're saying we're not telling the governments of the world and the companies of the world how to set up their governance structures. It'll vary by company, by country, by both. But we are going to say in these 6 principles that whatever you do set up, these 6 things should underlie those foundations somewhere and be existent to some significant extent in any corporate governance program that you see. Why the reference is made to the principles from the OECD as being non-prescriptive, and you'll see why in a few moments what we mean by non-prescriptive. You'll see that the principles of suggestion to all the companies and countries of the world about what they ought to be doing. Of course, if the OECD finds out that a particular country or set of entities in that country are not adhering to these 6 principles, I can assure you that they're going to find a way to get into your grits wherever you are in the world to find out exactly why any of these principles are not actually the underlying factors with regards to any government programs in any country, any entity around. Like I said earlier, hopefully the OECD is practicing what they preach. They claim that these principles are evolutionary in nature, and therefore the world, I guess, should be grateful that they have put them forth for our benefit. That doesn't mean that the principles are not great ones. They are, and more prescriptive corporate governance requirements, you'll see perhaps the significant differences between a prescriptive set of programs and a more principles based. Okay? All right. So, any questions so far on what Thea had to say about these principles and what they represent by the OECD? All right, great. Now, there are 6 of them, the 6 principles of corporate governance, and you would note that under each one we have a opening salvo with some comments, and then we have some ABCs of what should be basically incorporated. I'm not, as far as testing is concerned, I'm not going to necessarily ask you to try to remember every single prescriptive note under every single principle, but I will say that first of all, you must, for your test, you must know what the 6 principles are, and she just outlined them pretty much earlier with regards to the different chapters, ensuring the basis for an effective governance framework, rights and equitable treatment of shareholders, institutional investors, and the intermediaries, the role of stakeholders, disclosure, and the responsibilities of the board, as we've seen in our early discussions as well. You will need to know those 6 principles. And of course, you will need to know which each principle is trying to suggest. For example, in number 1, ensuring the basis for an effective corporate governance framework, you need to know that under this particular principle, entities, companies, even governments should be promoting transparency and fair markets. They shouldn't be allowing for any unfairness to be going on, market manipulation, or any other activities within the markets. And of course, the encouraging the efficient allocation of resources, whatever they might be. And nobody can put anything in place to manipulate the system. Okay, so you need to know under each particular principle that is the underlying factor, and then of course I might say what are one of the two list one or two of the issues that are noted with regards to that particular principle. For example, for principle number 1, you might want to say that the framework should be developed to impact overall economic performance, and then 2, the legal and regulatory requirements. So just basically have an idea of what it represents. I don't expect for you to remember to respond verbatim to this stuff. I just expect for you to know, for example, what the principles are, what the underlying issue is between under each principle, and to be able to make 1 or 2 comments on what kind of information is expected within each of those underlying principles. Okay? So just keep that in mind, and, at least for examination purposes from an OECD perspective. All right. I need another reader. Do I have a volunteer to do these 6 principles for me? Any volunteers?
I have to read all 6, or I could do one and someone else do the second one.
No, you can do one and somebody can do the second one.
Okay, I'll do the
That,
first.
that means you've already looked at it to see that, that's pretty long. And you're right, okay? Yeah, why don't you do one? Let's go. Number
I'll do
one.
the second one then.
I'll do
Okay,
the third one.
excellent, excellent. And I do admit that, yeah, they do have some extensive underlying points that they want those of us who are looking at these principles to consider. So let's go. Principle number 1.
Okay, ensuring the basis for an effective corporate governance framework. The corporate governance framework should promote transparent and fair markets and the efficient allocation of resources. It should be consistent with the rule of law and support effective supervision and enforcement. Effective corporate governance requires a sound legal, regulatory, and institutional framework that market participants can rely on when they establish their private contractual relations. This corporate governance framework typically comprises elements of legislation, regulation, self-regulatory arrangements, voluntary commitments, and business practices that are a result of a country's specific circumstances, history, and tradition. The desirable mix between legislation, regulation, self-regulation, voluntary standards, etc., will therefore vary from country to country. The legislative and regulatory elements of the corporate governance framework can usefully be complemented by soft law elements based on the comply or explain principle, such as corporate governance codes, in order to allow for flexibility and address specificities of individual companies. What works well in one company for one investor or a particular stakeholder may not necessarily be generally applicable to corporations, investors, and stakeholders that operate in another context and under different circumstances. As new experiences accrue and business circumstances change, the different provisions of the corporate governance framework should be reviewed and, when necessary, adjusted. Countries seeking to implement the principles should monitor their corporate governance framework, including regulatory and listing requirements and business practices, with the objective of maintaining and strengthening its contribution to market integrity and economic performance. As part of this, it is important to take into account the interactions and complementarity between different elements of the corporate governance framework and its overall ability to promote ethical, responsible, and transparent corporate governance practices. Such analysis should be viewed as an important tool in the process of developing an effective corporate governance framework. To this end, effective and continuous consultation with the public is an essential element. In some jurisdictions, this may need to be complemented by initiatives to inform companies and their stakeholders about the benefits of implementing sound corporate governance practices. Moreover, in developing a corporate governance framework in each jurisdiction, national legislators and regulators should duly consider the need for and the results from effective international cooperation. If these conditions are met, the corporate governance framework is more likely to avoid overregulation, support the exercise of entrepreneurship, and limit the risk of damaging conflicts of interest in both the private sector and in public institutions. A, the corporate governance framework should be developed with a view to its impact and overall economic performance, market integrity, and the incentives it creates for both market participants and the promotion of transparent and well-functioning markets. The corporate form of organization of economic activity is a powerful force for growth. The regulatory and legal environment within which corporations operate is therefore of key importance to overall economic outcomes. Policymakers also have a responsibility to put in place a framework that is flexible enough to meet the needs of corporations operating in widely different circumstances, facilitating their development of new opportunities to create value and to determine the most efficient deployment of resources. Where appropriate, corporate governance frameworks should therefore allow for proportionality, in particular with respect to the size of listed companies. Other factors that may call for flexibility include the company's ownership and control structure, geographical presence, sectors of activity, and the company's stage of development. Policymakers should remain focused on ultimate economic outcomes, and when considering policy options, they will need to undertake an analysis of the impact on key variables that affect the functioning of markets. For example, in terms of incentive structures, the efficiency of self-regulatory systems and dealing with systemic conflicts of interest. Transparent and well-functioning markets serve to discipline market participants and to promote accountability. B, the legal and regulatory requirements that affect corporate governance practices should be consistent with the rule of law, transparent and enforceable. If new laws and regulations are needed, such as to deal with clear cases of market imperfections, they should be designed in a way that makes them possible to implement and enforce in an efficient and even-handed manner covering all parties. Consultation by government and other regulatory authorities with corporations, their representative organizations, and other stakeholders is an effective way of doing this. Mechanisms should also be established for parties to protect their rights. In order to avoid overregulation, unenforceable laws, and unintended consequences that may impede or distort business dynamics, policy measures should be designed with a view to their overall costs and benefits. Public authorities should have effective enforcement and sanctioning powers to deter dishonest behavior and provide for sound corporate governance practices. In addition, enforcement can also be pursued through private action, and the effective balance between public and private enforcement will vary depending upon the specific features of each jurisdiction. Corporate governance objectives are also formulated in voluntary codes and standards that do not have the status of law or regulation. While such codes play an important role in improving corporate governance arrangements, they might leave shareholders and other stakeholders with uncertainty concerning their status and implementation. When codes and principles are used as a national standard or as a complement to legal or regulatory provisions, market credibility requires that their status in terms of coverage, implementation, compliance, and sanctions is clearly specified. C, the division of responsibilities among different authorities should be clearly articulated and designed to serve the public interest. Corporate governance requirements and practices are typically influenced by an array of legal domains, such as company law, securities regulation, accounting and auditing standards, insolvency law, contract law, labor law, and tax law. Corporate governance practices of individual companies are also often influenced by human rights and environmental laws. Under these circumstances, there's a risk that the variety of legal influences may cause unintentional overlaps and even conflicts, which may frustrate the ability to pursue key corporate governance objectives. It is important that policymakers are aware of this risk and take measures to limit it. Effective enforcement also requires that the allocation of responsibilities for supervision, implementation, and enforcement among different authorities is clearly defined so that the competencies of complementary bodies and agencies are respected and used most effectively. Potentially conflicting objectives, for example, where the same institution is charged with attracting business and sanctioning violations, should be avoided or managed through clear governance provisions. Overlapping and perhaps contradictory regulations between jurisdictions is also an issue that should be monitored so that no regulatory vacuum is allowed to develop, i.e., issues slipping through in which no authority has explicit responsibility, and to minimize the cost of compliance with multiple systems by corporations. When regulatory responsibilities or oversight are delegated to non-public bodies, it is desirable to explicitly assess why and under what circumstances. Such delegation is desirable. In addition, the public authority should maintain effective safeguards to ensure that the delegated authority is applied fairly, consistently, and in accordance with the law. It is also essential that the governance structure of such delegated institution be transparent and encompass the public interest. D, stock market regulation should support effective corporate governance. Stock markets can play a meaningful role in enhancing corporate governance by establishing and enforcing requirements that promote effective corporate governance by their listed issuers. Also, stock markets provide facilities by which investors can express interest or disinterest in a particular issuer's governance by allowing them to buy or sell the issuer's securities as appropriate. The quality of the stock market's rules and regulations that establish listing criteria for issuers and that govern trading on its facilities is therefore an important element of the corporate governance framework. What traditionally were called stock exchanges today come in a variety of shapes and forms. Most of the large stock exchanges are now profit maximizing and themselves publicly traded joint stock companies that operate in competition with other profit maximizing stock exchanges and trading venues. Regardless of the particular structure of the stock market, policymakers and regulators should assess the proper role of stock exchanges and trading venues in terms of standard setting, supervision, and enforcement of corporate governance rules. This requires an analysis of how the particular business models of stock exchanges about the incentives and ability to carry out these functions. E, supervisory, regulatory, and enforcement authorities should have the authority, integrity, and resources to fulfill their duties in a professional and objective manner. Moreover, their rulings should be timely, transparent, and fully explained. Supervisory, regulatory, and enforcement responsibilities should be vested with bodies that are operationally independent and accountable in the exercise of their functions and powers, have adequate powers, proper powers, including with respect to corporate governance. Many countries have addressed the issue of political independence of the securities supervisor through the creation of a formal government body, a board, council, or commission, whose members are given fixed terms of appointment. If the appointments are staggered and made independent from the political calendar, they can further enhance independence. These bodies should be able to pursue their functions without conflicts of interest, and their decisions should be subject to judicial or administrative review. When the number of corporate events and the volume of disclosures increase, the resources of supervisory, regulatory, and enforcement authorities may come under strain. As a result, in order to follow developments, they will have a significant demand for a fully qualified staff to provide effective oversight and investigative capacity, which will need to be appropriately funded. The ability to attract staff on competitive terms will enhance the quality and independence of supervision and enforcement. F, cross-border cooperation should be enhanced, including through bilateral and multilateral arrangements for exchange of information. High levels of cross-border ownership and trading require strong international cooperation among regulators, including through bilateral and multilateral arrangements for exchange of information. International cooperation is becoming increasingly relevant for corporate governance, notably where companies are active in many jurisdictions, both listed and unlisted entities, and seek multiple stock market listings on exchanges in different jurisdictions.
Thank you very much, Gia. They wasted no time in making sure they told us everything they wanted to know, obviously. Let me just say, for the purposes of your examination next week, with regards to these 6 principles, yeah, you need to be able to list those principles and be able to say something about them. The something that I'll require you to be able to say about them is the very introductory sentence in A, B, C, D, E, and F. I certainly don't expect to remember all the subsequent details, even though you for your examination purposes. What I do want you to remember is what the rule or the principle is and what is the key core sentence of each of those principles in the A through F, which in this example is A, the corporate governance framework, B, the legal and regulatory requirements, C, those introductory statements. I might ask you to say something about those statements. The details of each of those statements is for your own benefit and development. I will not test you on those details next week, okay? If that will help anybody in the room. Any questions so far? Okay, one of the reasons why I am laboring you through the details of these principles outside just the core introductory statements is that I want you to, as students and professionals, to hear the language of this governance program and how extensive it is. It's not just what's going on in your organization at the board level, but it's what's going on in organizations around the world, including public, private entities, etc., and how we all interconnected all of a sudden because of these OECD principles and requirements. The whole world is tied up in governance issues. And if anybody decides that they don't care if they have a good reputation or not, I think we're beginning to see by now that those countries and those entities will suffer significant damage if they are found to be countries and entities with poor governance reputations, okay? For better or for worse. Okay, who's my next reader?
I am.
Okay, let it rip.
2, the rights and equitable treatment of shareholders and key ownership functions.
I just joined. Can you tell me which document you're using?
Okay, update someone.
The G20 OECD principles.
Page 18.
For me, it's page 20.
Do you see it?
I don't know why they number differently. It's page 18 for me.
That's weird. We're on OECD principles number 2.
OECD principles. That's the name of the
Yes.
document.
Yes, the OECD 6 principles.
Sorry, I say on page 20 because I have it counting for me for the PDF. It's page 18 on the document itself, but I guess it's 20 pages.
Yes, we're on principle number. Do you see it?
I found a document.
Okay, principle number 2, that's where we are.
Okay.
Roman numeral 2. Yeah, just scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. Okay, let's roll then.
Okay. The corporate governance framework should protect and facilitate the exercise of shareholders' rights and ensure the equitable treatment of all shareholders. Pardon me?
Keep going.
Of all shareholders, including minority and foreign shareholders. All shareholders should have the opportunity to obtain effective redress and for violation of their rights. Equity investors have certain property rights. For example, an equity share in a publicly traded company can be bought, sold, or transferred. An equity share also entitles the investor to participate in the profits of the corporation, with liability limited to the amount of the investment. In addition, ownership of the equity shares provides a right to information about the corporation and a right to influence the corporation, primarily by participation in general shareholder meetings and by voting. As a practical matter, however, the corporation cannot be managed by shareholder referendum. The shareholding body is made up of individuals and institutions whose interests, goals, investment horizons, and capabilities vary. Moreover, the corporation's management must be able to take business decisions rapidly. In light of these realities and the complexity of managing the corporation's affairs in fast-moving and ever-changing markets, Shareholders are not expected to assume responsibility for managing corporate activities. The responsibility for corporate strategy and operations is typically placed in the hands of the board and the management team that is selected, motivated, and when necessary, replaced by the board. Shareholders' rights to influence the corporation center on certain fundamental issues, such as the election of board members or other means of influencing the composition of the board, amendments to the company's organic documents, approval of extraordinary transactions, and other basic issues as specified in law and internal company statutes. Let me scroll. Hold on. This section can be seen as a statement of the most basic rights of shareholders, which are recognized by law in most countries. Additional rights, such as the approval or election of auditors, the ability to pledge shares, the approval of distributions of profits, shareholder ability to vote on board member and or key executive compensation, approval of material related party transactions, and others have also been established in various jurisdictions. Investors' confidence that the capital they provide will be protected from misuse or misappropriation by corporate managers, board members, or controlling shareholders is an important factor in the development and proper functioning of capital markets. Corporate boards, managers, and controlling shareholders may have the opportunity to engage in activity that advance their own interests at the expense of non-controlling stakeholders. In providing protection to investors, a distinction can usefully be made between ex ante and ex post shareholder rights. Ex ante rights are, for example, preemptive rights and qualified majorities for certain decisions. Post rights allow the seeking of redress once rights have been violated. In jurisdictions where the enforcement of the legal and regulatory framework is weak, it can be desired within the ex ante rights of shareholders, such as by low share ownership thresholds for placing items on the agenda of the shareholders' meetings, or by requiring a supermajority of shareholders for certain decisions. The principles support equal treatment for foreign and domestic shareholders in corporate governments. They do not address government policies to regulate foreign direct investment. One of the ways in which shareholders can enforce their rights is to be able to initiate legal and administrative proceedings against management and board members. Experience has shown that an important determinant of the degree to which shareholder rights are protected is whether effective methods exist to obtain redress or grievances at a reasonable cost and without excessive delay. The confidence of minority investors is enhanced when the legal system provides mechanisms for minority shareholders to bring lawsuits when they have reasonable grounds to believe that their rights have been violated. The provision of such enforcement mechanisms is a key responsibility of legislators and regulators. There is some risk that the legal system, which enables any investor to challenge corporate activity in the courts, can become prone to excessive litigation. Thus, many legal systems have introduced provisions to protect management and board members against litigation abuse in the form of tests for the sufficiency of shareholder complaints, so-called safe harbors for management and board member actions, such as the business judgment rule, as well as safe harbors for the disclosure of information. In the end, a balance must be struck between allowing investors to seek remedies for infringement of ownership rights and avoiding excessive litigation. Many countries have found that alternative adjudication procedures, such as administrative hearings or arbitration procedures organized by the securities regulators or other regulatory bodies, are an efficient method for dispute settlement, at least at the first instance level. Specialized court procedures can Also be practical instrument to obtain timely injunctions and ultimately facilitate the rapid settlement of disputes. A, basic shareholder rights should include the right to 1, secure methods of ownership registration, 2, convey or transfer shares, 3, obtain relevant and material information on the corporation on a timely and regular basis, 4, participate and vote in general shareholder meetings, 5, elect and remove members of the board, and 6, share in the profits of the corporation.
Sikapin, before you go down to B, notice that great explanation that was given about shareholders' rights. And in case you may have been wondering and just didn't ask, there's a lot of infighting going on in many organizations between shareholders and boards and senior management, whether you are aware of it or not. And so this second principle is designed to highlight the importance of ensuring that shareholders are treated properly and equitably within the company, because some directors and senior management people get together and they act like they're the enemy of the owners by their very behavior, by their ability, their agreement together to not give shareholders the proper information, to hide details that shareholders need to know, and all this kind of stuff. And of course, to quote unquote mistreat minority shareholders who don't own a lot of shares in the company, but who are in fact still owners of the firm, that may not be able to get any answers or disclosures from management, because management thinks that since they're a minority, they only have a couple of shares there and there, they don't need to quote unquote waste their time with such shareholders. Okay? And the principle basically says to boards and senior management people, don't do that. That is wrong. If somebody owns one share in your company, they are a shareholder, albeit minority shareholders. The proper governance thing to do is to disclose to them in the same way as you would to any other shareholders. Okay, and that is why in A, it is outlined clearly after that full discussion that was just given that the shareholder, whether they're majority or minority, have some basic rights, and they list them. Okay, 1, 2, 3, made it clear, because whether you're aware of it or not, major fighting goes on in some firms. Just how there are people fighting with the board in church about the church board didn't do this and the church board down on Carmichael didn't do that, and the membership is pissed off with the board who wants this and that to happen. Same kinds of stuff. Okay, and so sometimes it gets to a point where shareholders have to actually sue their own board and senior management to get information that they should be automatically entitled to under proper governance principles. Okay, believe it or not. All right, and the whole idea is in raising these governance principles in this forum is to make you aware of the circumstances and even the language of this whole game. A lot of the X and anti stuff you may not understand at the moment, and you don't need to understand it all at the moment. That's just legal jargon for managing the corporate side of the firm. But you do get the principle of what we're trying to say here. Do not mistreat the shareholders. They own the company. And if you go too far, they will sue you as directors and senior management people. Unfortunate, but it happens. All right. All right, B.
E, shareholders should be sufficiently informed about and have the right to approve or participate in decisions concerning fundamental corporate changes, such as 1, amendments to the statutes or articles of incorporation or similar governing documents of the company. 2, the authorization of additional shares. And 3, ordinary transactions, including the transfer of all or substantially all assets that in effect result in the sale of the company.
And these, of course, are very important issues, which, believe it or not, senior management and boards sometimes fail to disclose to shareholders or even get their involvement because they don't want them involved because they fear that the shareholders might get in their grits, quote unquote, God forbid. How that can happen with the people who actually own the company. Okay, C.
So skip the poverty ability.
Yeah, just for you guys to have fun reading. I just want to highlight the core stuff that I want you to focus on.
Okay. C. Oh boy, skip it. C. Shareholders should have the opportunity to participate effectively and vote in general shareholder meetings and should be informed of the rules, including voting procedures that govern general shareholder meetings. Shareholders, 1, shareholders should be furnished with sufficient and timely information concerning the date, location, and agenda of general meetings, as well as full and timely information regarding the issues to be decided at the meeting.
You might be
2,
surprised to find that sometimes boards deliberately send information to shareholders late so that they cannot attend the meeting because they don't want them there. These are absolute no-nos. And notice the text takes the time under OEC governance principles to raise these core issues. And the reason why they're being raised is because they are big, big problems from small to medium to multi-billion-dollar companies. And it's a constantly growing problem. All of these things that are highlighted, that's why they continue to appear under these governance principles issues. All right, keep going. Number 2.
Number 2, processes and procedures for general shareholder meetings should allow for equitable treatment of all shareholders. Company procedures should not make it unduly difficult or expensive to cast votes. Do you just want me to,
Yeah, go down to 3. The other
okay,
reading is for your benefit.
okay. 3, shareholders should have the opportunity to ask questions to the board, including questions relating to the annual external audit, to place items on the agenda of general meetings, and to propose resolutions subject to reasonable limitations. 4, effective shareholder participation in key corporate governance decisions, such as the nomination and election of board members, should be facilitated. Shareholders should be able to make their views known, including through votes at shareholder meetings on the remuneration of board members and or key executives as applicable. The equity for board members and employees should be subject to shareholder approval. 5, shareholders should be able to vote in person or in absentia.
Yep,
And
absentia.
An equal effect should be given to votes whether cast in person or in absentia. 6, impediments to cross-border voting should be eliminated. D, shareholders, including institutional shareholders, should be allowed to consult with each other on issues concerning their basic shareholder rights as defined in the principles, subject to exceptions to prevent abuse.
Number 7.
E,
Oh, you're in E. Okay.
yeah, E. All shareholders of the same series of class should be treated equally. Capital structures and arrangements that enable certain shareholders to obtain a degree of influence or control disproportionate to their equity, pardon me?
Keep going.
To their equity ownership should be disclosed. Within any series of a class, all shares should carry the same rights. All investors should be able to obtain information about the rights attached to all series and classes of shares before they purchase. Any changes in economic or voting rights should be subject to approval by those classes of shares which are negatively affected. 2, the disclosure of capital structures and control arrangements should be required. F, related party transactions should be approved, conducted in a manner that ensures proper management of conflict and protects the interests of the company and its shareholders. 1, conflicts of interest inherent in related party transactions should be addressed. 2, members of the board and key executives should be required to disclose to the board whether they directly, indirect material interest in any transaction or matter directly affecting the corporation. G, minority shareholders should be protected from abusive actions by or in the interest of shareholders acting either directly or indirectly and should have effective means of redress. Abusive self-dealing should be prohibited. H. Oh, sorry. H. Markets for corporate control should be allowed to function in an efficient and transparent manner. 1. The rules and procedures governing the acquisition of corporate control in the capital market and extraordinary transactions, such as mergers and sales of be clearly articulated and disclosed so that investors understand their rights and record. Transactions should occur at transparent to protect the rights of all shareholders according to their class. 2. Anti-takeover devices should not be used to shield management and the board from accountability. And that's it for 2.
Are we still on the point number 6?
Mm. Well, after 6, it comes D, so.
Okay, so do you have a 7 and 8?
5, 6. No, I have letters that go to H.
Okay, so you don't have anything after 6, no other numbers, 7 and 8. Okay, does anybody else have a 7 and 8?
No, I don't have a 7 and 8. I'm at 6, and then just as she said.
Okay,
I don't even have 6.
okay, so everybody
I have
ends
H and then 2.
6
and that's
before
it.
H.
before 8.
I
Yeah.
don't have that.
You on page,
I don't have that.
you on
Yeah.
page 23, Maria?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
number 6,
So,
right.
so
and then
we're all
the
up to
red.
6 and the impediments, the cross-border voting, and then the notations under that.
Let's
Right,
start
and
from
that's
D.
it.
Okay, great. That's where we'll draw the line. I wouldn't worry about 7 and 8. Okay. Principle number 2. All right. Very much. Who's my third reader again?
I can read.
Okay. Is that Ronaldo?
Charles.
Charles. Okay, Charles. When you get into reading, yeah, you can pick up with principle number 3. But before we get to principle number 3, let me just do some housekeeping while I have everybody, in case somebody have to dash off for 1 minute and come back quickly. Just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, let me just complete my register to make sure that everybody is here. Indira, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, wonderful. In case you're wondering why I like to say Indira, because I have a cousin whose name is Indira. I know think about Indira Gandhi from India, and I love the name Indira. How's that?
My name is actually Indira.
Indira.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what Indira says too. Says she tells me her name is Indira. I'm like, okay, Indira, if you insist. Is there any difference between Indira and Indira? Oh, it's just a pronunciation.
My name and one is not.
All right, Indira. Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, Makita.
Here.
Okay, Makita is here. Maria.
Here.
Okay, Maria is there. Paulette.
Here.
Paulette, okay. Wonderful. Thea. I know Thea was here, so Charles, I know Charles is going to read for us. Kia, are you there, Kia? Smith? Laura? Are you there, Laura? I know Ronaldo is there. And Gia is there. Okay, is there anybody's name I didn't call?
Mr. Wilkinson, did you get me last week as well? This is Gia.
Let's see. Hang on, Gia. Last week? Yes, I have you for last week.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. All right, a little bit about the midterm exam next week while I help everybody. First of all, let me say that sometime during this week, I will be sending you a case study, which will not be due until the end of the semester. If you finish it before the end of the semester and you would like to submit it, that is fine. Otherwise, you have until the final night of class to submit it. Once it's done, it's not a forever case study. Has some questions at the end for you to answer, but I'll send that to you for you to get started. You certainly will be given all the time you need. If you have any questions about the case study along the way, feel free to raise them either during the class sessions or otherwise. Okay, so please make a note of that. I don't know if I said it before, but the passing grade for governance and financial literacy is actually 50%. So it should not be difficult for all of my students to at least pass the class. I know that some persons will be working beyond passing the class. I expect that from everybody, but you certainly should be able to get over that line. Let me just say for your information, at the end of the day, if you score between 50 and 69 overall, the Institute will grade that as a C grade. From 70 to 84%, it'll be graded as a B grade, and 85 to 100% will be graded as an A grade. And that final grade will be the result of your midterm, your final exam, your participation and attendance to class, as well as your case study. So all of that will be mixed up together like tongue salad, and then whatever falls out of the pot will be one of those three. As you can see, I'm not having any discussion about anything under 50. That means that I expect everybody to get 50 or more. Kind of an expectation, but that's it. Also, in terms of information that might help you with your study, in addition to what I said earlier about the OECD principles, I just want you to focus on what the 6 principles are and the core points, the ABCD 1, 2, 3 points of each of those principles. You certainly want to be aware of the role, responsibilities, and activities of boards. We've been talking about that from the beginning. INEDs and their functions, board committees and their functions. You need to know all of those things in order to answer definitions and short answer questions. Certainly, the duties and responsibilities of senior management, and of course, the rights and responsibilities of shareholders. If you are even vaguely familiar with those things, you should be fine. And the more familiar you are with them, the better you will score on your test next week. Okay? There will be no surprises. Your test will cover material that we've done up to the end of class tonight, and there'll be no fastballs and no slide balls. Okay? It'll be stuff that I've mentioned to you and certainly that we've discussed in our sessions. Any questions? Okay. Okay, so Charles, in that case, you can pick up principle number 3 then.
Thank you.
Move on.
Institutional investors, stock markets, and other intermediaries. Work should provide sound incentives throughout the investment chain and provide stock markets to function in a way that contributes to good corporate governance. In order to be effective, the legal and regulatory framework for corporate governance must be developed with a view to the economic reality in which it is to be implemented. In many jurisdictions, the real world of corporate governance and ownership is no longer characterized by a straight and uncompromised relationship between the performance of the company and the income of the ultimate beneficiaries or shareholdings. In reality, the investment chain is often long and complex, with numerous intermediaries that stand between the ultimate beneficiary and the company. The presence of intermediaries acting as independent decision makers influences the incentives and the ability to engage in corporate governance. The share of equity investments held by institutional investors, such as mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and hedge funds, has increased significantly, and many of their assets are managed by specialized asset managers. The ability and interest of institutional investors and asset managers to engage in corporate governance varies widely. For some, engagement in corporate governance, including the exercise of voting rights, is a natural part of their business model. Others may offer their beneficiaries and clients a business model and investment strategy that does not include or motivate spending resources on active shareholder engagement. If shareholder engagement is not part of the institution's business model and investment strategy, mandatory requirements to engage, for example, through voting, may be ineffective and lead to a box-ticking approach. The principles recommend that institutional investors disclose their policies with respect to corporate governance. Voting at shareholder meetings is, however, only one channel for shareholder engagement. Direct contact and dialogue with the board and management represent other forms of shareholder engagement that are frequently used. In recent years, some countries have begun to consider adoption of codes on shareholder engagement, stewardship codes, that institutional investors are invited to sign up to on a voluntary basis. A. Investors acting in a fiduciary capacity should disclose their corporate governance and voting policies with respect to their investments, including the procedures that they have in place for deciding on the use of their voting rights.
Let me just say this before you go on to B, that the primary institutional investors, that in case you were wondering who they are, tend to be pension funds and trustees. There are other types as well, but those tend to be the two primary institutional investors who are investing money on behalf of persons who have pension funds within organizations, government pension funds, and certainly trusteeships with gazillions of dollars that trustees are responsible for. And of course, all of these groups have a responsibility and a duty to invest the assets of their pension funds and the trust funds and so on in order to maximize returns. And so these are the key institutional investors that we're talking about, who must be guided by proper corporate governance and not get sucked into the world of espionage and fraud and theft as they seek to execute their fiduciary duties for these persons who are called pensioners and beneficiaries. All right. Okay. B.
B. Votes should be cast by custodians or nominees in line with the directions of the beneficial owner of the shares.
C.
Institutional investors acting in a fiduciary capacity should disclose how they manage material conflicts of interest that may affect the exercise of key ownership rights regarding their investments. D. The corporate governance framework should require that proxy advisors, analysts, brokers, rating agencies, and others that provide analysis of or advice relevant to decisions by investors. Disclose and minimize conflicts of interest that might compromise the integrity of their analysis or advice. E. Insider trading and market manipulation should be prohibited and the applicable rules enforced.
Okay, before you go on, Charles, let me just say, if you haven't seen already A through E, how crucial these principles are, and any violations of any of them can create and have created in the past major problems for pensioners and beneficiaries and others who rely on the good, fair, honest governance practices of these institutional investors who are responsible for their money. In the Bahamas, in case you wondered, can anybody say who is a major institutional investor in the Bahamas that we all have an interest in? What is the name? Institutional investor in the Bahamas?
NIB?
Of course. Why are we interested in NIB as an institutional investor? Anyone?
Because it's a mandatory investment.
Not only a mandatory investment, but what is the primary function of NIB?
It takes care of the pension.
Yeah, it's where we send our money every month for an average of what? 20 to 30 years, correct?
For us to collect.
Yeah, so when we retire, whatever that works out to be on a monthly basis, we expect to collect it, and we expect to collect all of it until we what?
Supposedly.
Of course. Yes, indeed. And so if NIB is exercising poor governance and lending all of our money to the government who doesn't pay it back, or somebody else who doesn't pay it back, you can see right away that governance principle is not going to hold, and we're all going to suffer as a result. I'm sure some of you have heard already people making the stake that NIB is running out of money and they need to increase NIB fees, which they will soon anyway. They have to, in order to make sure that there's sufficient money at the end of the day when you guys retire. Because I know for sure when I go there, whenever that is, and they try to tell me some story, I'm bombing the place. Really not bombing the place. I don't want you to come and arrest me. But what I'm saying is that is a local, crucial institutional investor that every single working Bahamian in this country ought to have an interest in. Not only does NIB provide us with pensions at the end of our work life, but they also provide us with other benefits as well. Are you aware of that? Like all the tens of millions of dollars that was paid out in the last year during the pandemic. All the unemployment benefits that were not planned, that were 10 times more than they normally pay out in any year. So this institutional investor is crucial for us. Okay? So as far as that particular principle is concerned, we definitely can identify with that requirement. All right, keep going. Principle number 4.
Okay, we're wrapping up. We're actually on F.
Oh, you have an F?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, and F says?
F says, and I lost it. Sorry.
Okay.
A, B, C. F. For companies who are listed in a jurisdiction other than their jurisdiction of incorporation, the applicable corporate governance laws and regulations should be clearly disclosed. In the case of cross listings, the criteria and procedure for recognizing the listing requirements of the primary listing should be transparent and documented. G. Stock markets should provide fair and efficient price discovery as a means to help promote effective corporate governance. That completes 3.
Okay,
Me, sorry.
sorry, principle number
Fine.
4.
All right, I'm coming. Okay, the role of stakeholders in corporate governance. The corporate governance framework should recognize the rights of stakeholders established by law or through mutual agreements and encourage active cooperation between corporations and stakeholders in creating wealth, jobs, and the sustainability of financially sound enterprises. Do you want me to read all of them or just
No, just the main points, A through, I think it's E or F, A through E.
Okay.
Yeah.
A, the rights of stakeholders that are established by law or through mutual agreements are to be respected. B, where stakeholder interests are protected by law, stakeholders should have the opportunity to obtain effective redress for a violation of the rights. C, mechanism for employee participation should be permitted to develop. Oh, I like
Yeah, oh yeah.
that. D, where stakeholders participate in the corporate governance process, they should have access to relevant, sufficient, and reliable information on a timely and regular basis. What you want? Hi, sorry, hang on. I gotta take care of my cat. 1 minute. Can you give him some food, please? Sorry, my cat came back in for food. I know.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's pandemic.
I know. He thinks he's a person. Okay. D, where stakeholders participate in the corporate governance process, they should have access to relevant, sufficient, and reliable information on a timely and regular basis. E, stakeholders, including individual employees and representative bodies, should be able to freely communicate their concerns about illegal or unethical practices to the board and to the competent public authorities, and their rights should not be compromised for
Now
doing
stick
this.
up in 1 second, Paula, let me just say, those one statements might seem a little lighter, a little lighter compared to the others, but they're no less important than the others because stakeholders like employees in particular, who oftentimes get very little information other than on a need to know basis from managements and boards, who oftentimes should be telling their employees as major stakeholders in the companies more than they do. And so this particular principle is designed to encourage more disclosure to stakeholders like employees and governments and others and customers who have an interest in the company. And certainly if people have a concern, listen to it. And if it's legitimate, resolve it and come back and don't treat people as if, or employees or other stakeholders as if they're an interruption to the running of the business. A very common problem in many firms, and it's a governance violation. It doesn't seem to be a governance violation that some senior management people and boards seem to be aware of. And certainly if they are aware of it, they're certainly negligent in terms of how many of them practice. And some of the, in fact, some board members and senior management people are so rude and disagreeable that not only do they shut down employees and customers and other stakeholders if they don't want to deal with a particular issue, but they even try to hide stuff from shareholders, as we discussed earlier, to the extent that sometimes shareholders get so pissed off they have to sue their own board and senior management team to get information. That's absurd, but it happens. All right, keep going. Disclosure number 5. Sorry, principle number 5.
Are we ready?
Mhm.
We finished with, hold on a second. Oh, we have F.
There's an F. What does F say?
The corporate governance framework should be complemented by an effective, efficient insolvency framework and be effective and by effective enforcement of the creditor rights.
Okay, keep going. Principle number 5.
Oh, you want me to read that too?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Um, sorry, I have like 10 emails coming in. Disclosure and transparency. The corporate governance framework should ensure that timely and accurate disclosure is made on all material matters regarding the corporation, including our financial situation, performance, ownership, and governance.
Mhm.
Point
You stop. A.
A, it says disclosure should include, but not be limited to, material information on one, the financial and operating results of the company;
Hmm?
two, company objectives and non-financial information; three, major share ownership, including beneficial owners and voting rights; four, remuneration of members of the board and key executives; five, information about board members, including their qualifications, the selection process, other company directorships, and whether they are regarded independent by the board.
Now, bear in mind, we've had some of these discussions already, and we'll have some more before the night is out. But don't forget what the heading for Principle 5 is. It says transparency and disclosure. No lying,
Yes.
no misguiding. That's really what this part of the principle going.
Okay. I said five already.
Yep.
Okay. Six, related party transactions. Seven, foreseeable risk factors. Eight, issues regarding employees and other stakeholders. Nine, governance structures and policies, including the content of any corporate governance code or policy and the process by which it is implemented. Excuse me. B, information should be prepared and disclosed in accordance with high quality standards of accounting and financial and non financial reporting. C, annual audit should be conducted by an independent, competent, and qualified auditor in accordance with high quality auditing standards in order to provide an external and objective assurance to the board and shareholders that the financial statements fairly represent the financial position and performance of the company in all material respects.
All right. Thank you very much, Paulette. And an interesting point because following your midterm examination next week, we are going to get into some discussions about the audit process, just so that you can have a rounded approach to the governance perspective, because it seems that a lot of people don't believe that financial information statements and reporting and accuracy in reporting of financial information is really a part of the governance process, when in fact it's oftentimes part of the most significant set of problems that come out of governance in organizations. Okay, so keep that in mind uh, uh, as we go forward towards the next half of our semester. All right, and I need somebody to read the final principle for me, principle number 6, the responsibilities of the board.
It wasn't finished yet. We had D and E.
There's a D&E. Okay, keep going.
Excuse me. External auditors should be accountable to the shareholders and owe a duty to the company to exercise due professional care and the conduct of audit. E. Channels for disseminating information should provide for equal, timely, and cost-efficient access to relevant information by users.
Thank you very much. Actually, those 2 points are short but crucial. One is that the external auditors have a responsibility to shareholders. In other words, if they find something wrong, they should not let the chairman of the board or anybody else in the organization cause them not to disclose it to shareholders by promising them something, whatever that might be. They shouldn't do that. That is unethical for external auditors. They have a duty to report to the shareholders any findings that they have found. After all, the shareholders are the owners of the company. And after a while, and after some decades, sometimes certain persons at the board and senior management level seem like they forget who really owns the company. Okay, so very important point. All right, who's my reader for principal?
I guess I can.
I'll read.
Okay, who said that?
Maria.
Okay, Maria, fantastic. Number 6, the principle of responsibilities of the board.
Sorry. The corporate governance framework should ensure the strategic guidance of the company, the effective monitoring of management by the board, and the board's accountability to the company and the shareholders. A, board members should act on a fully informed basis in good faith with due diligence and care and in the best. B, where board decisions may affect different shareholder groups differently, the board should treat all shareholders fairly.
Yes.
The board should apply high ethical standards. It should take into account the interests of stakeholders. D, the board should fulfill certain key functions, including 1, reviewing and guiding corporate strategy, major plans of action, risk management policies and procedures, annual budgets and business plans, setting performance objectives, monitoring implementation and corporate performance, and overseeing major capital expenditures, acquisitions, and divestitures. 2, monitoring the effectiveness of the company's governance needed. 3, selecting, compensating, monitoring, and when necessary, replacing key executives and overseeing succession planning. 4, align key executive and board with the longer term interests of the company and its shareholders. 5, ensuring a formal and transparent nomination and election process. 6, monitoring and managing potential conflicts of interest of management, board members, and shareholders, including misuse of corporate assets and abuse in related party transactions. 7, ensuring the integrity of the corporation's accounting and financial reporting systems, including the independent audit, and that appropriate systems of control are in place, in particular systems for risk management, financial and operational control, and compliance with the law and relevant standards.
Mhm.
8, overseeing the process of disclosure and communications. E, the board should be able to exercise objective, independent judgment. 1, hold on, wait. Yeah. Boards should consider assigning a sufficient number of non-executive board capable of exercising independent judgment to tasks where there is a potential for conflict of interest. Examples of such key responsibilities are ensuring the integrity of financial and non-financial reporting, the review of related party transactions, nomination of board members and key executives, and board remuneration. Boards should consider setting up specialized committees to support the full board in performing its functions, particularly in respect to audit and depending upon the company's size and risk profile, also in respect to risk management and remuneration. When committees of the board are established, their mandate, composition, and working procedures should be well defined and disclosed by the board. Board members should be able to commit themselves effectively to their responsibilities. Boards should regularly carry out evaluations to appraise their performance and assess whether they possess the right mix of background and competences. In order to fulfill their responsibilities, board members should have access to accurate, relevant, and timely information. And G, when employee representation on the board is mandated, mechanisms should be developed to facilitate access to information and training for employee representatives so that this representation is exercised effectively and best contributes to the enhancements of boards, information, and independence.
Okay, so I don't think there's any doubt about what the board's responsibilities are as far as the OECD sixth principle is concerned. And so there we have it, all 6 of them staring us in the face. We know what they are. We know what the tenets underlying each of them are, and we know what kinds of behaviors and expectations are from each of those principles. I will give you a heads up. You will get a question on those principles and their responsibilities. So that means you can get 10 out of 10 or whatever the case might be there. All right. Any questions so far on what we've discussed in terms of the OECD, its principles and its intentions? All right. The rest of your notes pretty much rehashes what we've talked about earlier in the opening pages and certainly throughout our discussions. So please feel free to finish the reading on that. But for your test purposes, you will really only be responsible for where we've stopped just now in terms of those 6 principles. All right, so there are no final discussion for this evening, which has to do with the Central Bank of the Bahamas and its prescriptive requirements for corporate governance for financial institutions. Remember, of course, feel free to, if you have a question as we go in any of this stuff, you can interrupt me and raise the question. It's not a problem whatsoever. All right. So if you can turn to your CBOB notes then and go to page 8 under annual review, that will open our discussions on the central bank's requirements for financial institutions. Prior to page 8, just of the regulators' points of view, but the real core aspect of the governance side begins around page 8, where we'll begin under the annual review. And it is from that point on that you will be tested. But I do encourage you to read the other pages before that. Financial institution. All right. So, Andera.
Yes.
Okay, do you mind picking up the annual review for us again, please?
Which document is that?
The Bahamas corporate governance.
Okay, that's another document. I have to go back into my email. Can someone read while I say
Okay,
because
you
Annual
can pick
review.
up
I'll pick up, Mr. Wilkinson.
Ronaldo. Who wants? Okay, great. Pick up on page 8
Annual,
on the annual review, and then we'll have
okay,
Andera
annual
kick in later.
review. At least annually, the board utilizing the advice of management should assess, and document corporate governance process that it has implemented successfully achieves its objectives, and consequently whether the board itself is fulfilling its own responsibilities. The board should also regularly assess the effectiveness of its overall governance process and make changes necessary.
Now, before you go on, Laura, let me just say for those of you who may not have picked up on it yet, jumping into this annual review is now extending the discussion by the Central Bank of the Bahamas in this paper, saying to financial institutions, these are the kinds of things we expect you to be doing with regards to your governance program so that it can be effective and constructive as far as the regulators are concerned. Okay, so we just now into the central bank's prescription to financial institutions about how they ought to be behaving from a corporate governance perspective. All right, keep going.
In addition, the board should also determine that the licensee's capital level is adequate for Zoom throughout the entire organization. In this regard, the board and management should consider and plan for the licensee's current and prospective capital adequacies through evaluation of projected capital needs and profitability, implementation of an appropriate earnings retention policy, and the recognition of external sources of additional capital.
Hi, sorry,
Yes,
Miss.
question?
I'm looking at which document I'm looking at.
Central Bank of the Bahamas Corporate Governance Guidelines.
Oh, okay, all right. I
Yes,
apologize. I'm sorry.
no problem. And we're in page 8 under annual review. Okay. In other words, these are the things the central bank expect financial institutions to be doing on an annual basis as far as their governance programs are concerned. All right. Okay, keep going.
4.15, just so Paulette could
Yeah.
pick up. In
Mhm.
its review, the board should determine that A, the licensee's overall risk profile is sound and prudent, and that the risk is properly. B, new or significant changes to policies and procedures are appropriately reviewed and approved. C, the licensee's internal controls provide reasonable assurance of the integrity and reliability of records, safeguard, verify, and maintain accountability for its assets, and properly recognize its liabilities both on and off balance sheet.
Let me just say, for those of you who are not accountants, that many organizations, including banks and other financial institutions, use their financial statements to manipulate numbers and play games and improperly disclose information to shareholders and other stakeholders who require accurate and honest reporting. Okay? Whether you're aware of it or not, it happens more times than it should. It happens all too often, and this is why the central bank is saying clearly, like all the other institutions like the OECD and others, look, get it together. Stop cooking the book. Stop playing around with numbers. Stop failing to disclose. Stop disclosing liabilities that are not there. Start omitting liabilities that are there, and so on. Okay? This is why we have this heavy reliance on the integrity of the firms or the licensees, auditors, who are expected to be
Independent.
absolutely independent and full of integrity, with integrity and ethics spilling out of their bloody noses. Okay, keep going.
The internal controls are based on established policies and procedures and are implemented by trained, skilled personnel whose duties have been segregated appropriately. E, adherence to the established internal controls is continuously monitored. Systems and accounting records are complete, accurate, and timely. G, issues of concern are identified and addressed, and corrective action taken in a timely manner. H, all management and staff are required to maintain high corporate values and ethical standards pursuant to the licensee's established code of conduct. And I, independent non-executive directors have met the requirements for independence as set out in Section 7 of these guidelines.
Question for anybody before Laura goes on. Why do you think in I, the central bank bothers to say that the INED meets the requirements as set out in Section 7 of the guidelines? Why do you think they put it there specifically? Like, what are they telling, what is the central bank telling financial institutions? Don't lie about your INED. If they're not independent, be there. Don't put them there and say they're independent and you know they're not. Okay, that's the reason why it's there. Many independent directors or supposedly independent directors who are sitting on boards in financial institutions are not independent for one reason or another. They're just claiming to be. And the central bank is aware of this. And they're trying to remind financial institutions, guys, we're aware of some of these things. Let's try and do it according to the guidelines. Okay? All right, keep going.
The board should assess whether the licensee's control environment is appropriate and effective, taking into account the licensee's unique character, approach to governance, management and communications style, organizational structure, resource availability, procedures and controls, and the conduct of staff. 17. Through such a review, the board and management will demonstrate to the central bank, A, the overall effectiveness of their program to protect the interests of depositors, creditors, and other stakeholders, B, their ability to effectively identify, measure, manage, and control significant business activities and the risk associated with those activities, and C, their ability to address risk and control issues raised through internal and external audit, relevant supervisory authorities, and other sources. 18. The annual review should document the board of directors' remuneration scheme. Generally, non-executive directors are not paid a salary, but rather are paid a fee for their services. In the instance where non-executive directors have received or receive additional remuneration from the company apart from a director's fee, the same should be documented in the annual review along with the rationale and disclosed to the central bank by way of the annual corporate governance certificate.
Question for the floor. Why is the central bank making section 4.18 such a statement? Why are they saying that? That first of all, the INED should not be paid a salary, but rather a fee.
Because
And
they
if
shouldn't be
NED get,
employees of the organization to receive
yeah,
a salary.
usually employees get a salary. What's the other reason for saying if they get more than the fee, a bonus or anything more than their standard fee, it must be disclosed? What is the reason for that? Why would the central bank want to know that?
Was that to really maintain the independence, ensuring that they're not manipulated by any additional incentives?
No question about it. Okay, that is exactly right. And so sometimes companies might give the INED an incentive other than the fee, but they don't report it to the central bank. And the central bank knows this. That's why it makes the statement very clearly. All right. And any financial institution that decides that they're going to try to incentivize the INED and not report it to the central bank, and they're subsequently discovered, that may not bode well for that organization in one form or another. Okay. All right. Keep going. Annual certification.
Annually, within 120 days of the end of each calendar year, the board will require and provide a certification to the central bank's inspector of banks and trust companies, the inspector, in brackets, the inspector, as to the licensee's compliance or otherwise with the contents of these guidelines. Additionally, the certification should also state that using the advice and assistance of management, the board has independently assessed and documented whether the licensee's corporate governance process is effective and whether it successfully achieved its objectives. The board must report any material deficiencies and problems that are identified within the licensees, along with action plans and timetables for their correction.
Okay, and before you go on again, Laura, the reason for that is so that when the central bank comes in to do its inspections of credit unions and banks and domestic banks and whatever financial institutions we have, they will bring that document with them. And they will be seeking to see whether or not you disclose everything you were supposed to disclose. And if you said there were some issues, whether or not you resolve them as you said you would, and that you resolve them in a reasonable period of time. These are all governance guidelines by the central bank in an effort to keep all financial institutions in the Commonwealth on the quote unquote straight and narrow. All right, keep going.
The responsibilities of the board of directors. There's 5, sorry. In order to ensure effective management of risk and meet its overall corporate governance responsibility to its licensees, clients, and other stakeholders, including the central bank. 5.2, the board shall ensure competent management by A, appointing a chief executive with integrity, technical and managerial competence, and appropriate experience.
My, okay.
B, overseeing and participating in the appointment of other senior executives with the skills necessary to manage and supervise the licensee's business and staff. C, setting performance-based compensation policies, programs, goals, and standards for senior management and reviewing the compensation programs established by senior management for other management and staff. D, establishing a comprehensive framework for and then overseeing management setting and enforcing clear lines of responsibility and accountability throughout the organization. E, effectively evaluating the management's performance. F, developing and regularly updating a management succession plan. And G, establishing standards of business conduct and ethical behavior. 5.3, the board should clearly define and document its own authorities and responsibilities, including those of its chair, as well as those of senior management, and provide checks and balances over the actions of senior management. 5.4, effective corporate governance requires a high level of cooperation between the board and management. Management supervision is one of the board's most direct responsibilities. The board should ensure that the licensee's day-to-day operations are in the hands of a qualified, honest, and competent manager, and that the managers understand their responsibility. Management should be fully accountable to the board.
Yes.
5.5, the board of each licensee should ensure that the organization has clearly established its objectives and developed a strategy to achieve them. Business plans should be established to direct the day-to-day activities of the licensee. The board should approve these objectives, strategies, and plans and ensure that performance against them is regularly reviewed, providing for necessary corrective action and redirection. The annual budgeting process and periodic review. Lost my spot.
Mhm.
The annual budgeting process and periodic reviews of budget performance is an integral part of any planning and performance monitoring process. The board should also approve budgets and review performance against those budgets. In addition, the overall operating policies, standards, and procedures that govern the licensee's day-to-day business activities should be periodically reviewed, revised, and updated when necessary, and receive board approval. Comprehensive contingency plans addressing all significant risks identified in the organization should be put in place and tested and updated regularly. The board, utilizing the advice of management, should ensure that the internal control systems of the licensee are effective and that licensee's operations are properly controlled and comply with policies and procedures approved by the board, with laws and regulations of the Bahamas, and with guidelines and other regulatory and supervisory requirements of the central bank. The board and management should consistently demonstrate their strong commitment to implementing an effective risk control environment throughout the organization. The board should ensure that management implements an effective, independent reporting and assessment process, i.e., internal audit or equivalent, to confirm to the board the appropriate application of control policies and procedures. The board should ensure that management takes corrective action when deficiencies are identified in the licensee's control and compliance systems. The board should ensure that management develops, implements, and oversees the effectiveness of comprehensive, known to your customer standards, including appropriate policies and procedures that address customer acceptance and identification, as well as ongoing monitoring of accounts and transactions in keeping with the requirements of relevant law and regulations and guidelines. The
Still
board
wanna
must
be a board member?
sorry.
As you can see, I just raised the question, do you still want to be a board member? Clearly, Being a member of the board is no child's play if you're doing the job properly. Clearly, the board is not going to be involved in all the details, but they're certainly responsible for the results. Clearly, that means the board should be spending a lot of time delegating the responsibilities and checking to see whether or not they're done. And if they're not done, taking the appropriate action against those who are responsible to ensure to its shareholders that the organization is being governed accordingly. All right, keep going.
The board must also appoint a compliance officer, CO, who may also function as the money laundering reporting officer, MLRO, and in keeping with Regulation 5 of the Financial Intelligence Transactions Reporting Regulations 2001, to be responsible under its guidance for ensuring that the licensee is in full compliance with the laws of the Bahamas. The CO and the MLRO should be independent and free from influences that may affect his or her ability to perform his or her duties objectively. In particular, senior management, i.e., senior officer 1 or 2, senior official 1 and 2 of the licensees, exclusive of restrictive licensees, should not be appointed to such posts. Licensees that are subject to this requirement may request a waiver, provided that they are able to demonstrate to the central bank that there is sufficient independence. That there is sufficient independence. B, no client interfacing relationship role is assumed by the individual. C, all business is introduced by the group as an eligible introducer, and the individual is in a position to act independently.
In other words,
Where
before you go on, Laura, in other words, the compliance officer and the money laundering reporting officer, the MLRO, should be independent individuals, whether they're two separate people or both one person doing both jobs. And certainly nobody at the management level, senior officer 1 and 2, which is the CEO and his deputy or her deputy, should be acting as compliance officer and or money laundering reporting officer, with few exceptions. And those exceptions are noted in A through D. That should be very rare. The central bank does not want to see those exceptions, but if you can prove them all to the satisfaction of the central bank, they might allow it in rare cases. Other than that, proper governance dictates that those jobs should be held by somebody completely different from senior management, period. Keep going.
Where a waiver is granted in this instance, the licensee will be required to submit an annual formal attestation by the board that these conditions continue to apply. Furthermore, domestic commercial banks should have an independent compliance resource in each branch, or an independent compliant resource which supports a centralized compliance function. The CO and the MLRO should have direct, unrestricted access to the board and or group compliance.
So if you work for a retail bank, a domestic bank such as Royal Bank, Scotia Bank, Fidelity Bank, First Caribbean Bank, theoretically, each of those branches of each of those banks should have a compliance officer MLRO source, so that somebody is immediately available to deal with those jobs that are connected to compliance and MLRO. Of course, there might be a head sitting somewhere at head office, but theoretically, there should be such a person or such a reference in each branch. Okay? That's part of the governance process for financial institutions. All right, keep going.
The board may also use the determinations of the licensee's independent risk management and internal audit functions, if they are used to provide information on the safeguards for control effectiveness. The board should ensure that the licensee complies with established Bahamian financial services industry codes, codes of conduct and practice. It should also set the licensee's own standards of business conduct and ethical values that are communicated through the entire organization. The board should establish procedures to identify, monitor, and manage potential conflicts of interest of board members, management, and significant shareholders, and abuses in related party transactions, as well as an overall process to monitor adherence to the established standards of business conduct and ethical behavior. Specifically, transactions with related parties and the write-off of material related party exposures or those which pose special risks should be subject to prior approval by the licensee's board. Additionally, board members with conflicts of interest should be excluded from the approval process of granting and managing related party transactions. Of particular importance would be the board's policies regarding self-dealing, i.e. the policies and controls on business conducted with related parties and the directors themselves. The potential misuse of the corporation's corporate assets or the possible use of privileged information for personal advantage. It should likewise require that systems be in place to ensure that necessary confidentiality is maintained and that the privacy of the organization itself and its clients is not violated, that clients' rights and assets are properly safeguarded, and that no benefit can be gained from the improper use of confidential information, and that preferential treatment is not permitted. The board should also ensure that the organization's compensation and benefits policies are consistent with the ethical values, objectives, strategies, business operations, and control environment.
Before you finish this discussion, Laura, on the board's responsibilities, I think if you hadn't gotten it from session 2, 3, and 4, certainly by now you understand this grave responsibility that board members have. You probably understand also why the question of overboarding came up earlier in our discussions, in previous lectures, because if you're doing this job properly, you certainly don't want to be overboarding, because at some point you're going to become inefficient and ineffective, and perhaps even a liability to certain boards that you sit on. It is a huge responsibility, and given the nature, type, and size of organization you work for as a board member, certainly you can see the many challenges that theoretically would face each and every board member. There are some board members, if you see them, you wouldn't think so. They seem to be having a ball at board meetings. Maybe they're just great at multitasking. But we do hope that when they go into those boardrooms, that they're considering all of these things that we are discussing, because it is not optional, by the way, especially for financial institutions in the Bahamas. These things are mandatory. In our discussion earlier with the OECD principles, they're optional. Countries are encouraged to implement them. Companies are encouraged to implement them. But for the regulator called the Central Bank of the Bahamas and other regulators in the Bahamas, these things are not optional. They are mandatory. Okay, keep going.
The board should regularly review the licensee's financial statements and supporting documentation to ensure that they properly reflect the organization's underlying current and prospective financial condition and the status of its business plans. The board's review should include an assessment of the effectiveness and reliability of the organization's financial reporting and analysis function. The board should determine that the licensee can demonstrate that its operations individually and collectively, A, are subject to effective governance and managed in accordance with appropriate, effective, and prudent risk management processes, B, are supported by an appropriate control environment, C, effectively make use of the work of the internal, if used, and external auditors. And D, identify significant issues related to the overall governance process that appropriate timely actions are taken to address issues of concern.
Mhm.
Such determinations might be made through the use of self-assessments, stress scenario tests, and/or independent judgments made by external advisors.
Thank you very much. Laura, I think now you have the rest of us wondering whether we want to be a board member or not. But whether you're a board member or not, every organization, including the one that you work for, already has such a board. And depending on what type of organization it is, if it's a financial institution or of any kind, in the Bahamas, you know what the requirements are a little bit better. It's not optional. If you're not a financial institution requirement according to OECD and other principles of governance, it is still a requirement on an international basis. And the expectation is that you're expected to follow them. And if you don't, somebody will badmouth you on the international scene. And we all know from the American elections and everything else, once somebody badmouths you, dog eat your lunch. All right. This is one of the reasons why the Bahamas is very, very keen about being blacklisted. Remember, we were on the gray list until recently. We did everything we could. We're no longer on the gray list. The reason for that is we don't want anybody around the world saying that we have governance problems. Because once that happens, then the world starts to look at us with jaundiced eyes, which makes it difficult for us to do business in the capital markets, in the credit market, and certainly in the correspondent banking market. All right, something to keep in mind as professionals of any kind. All right, thank you very much, Laura. Indira, are we ready? Operations of the Board of Directors. Indira?
Hi, are we still on the same document?
Same document, number 6,
Okay.
section 6.
Okay, I'm still, the document that I have open, the Central Bank of the Bahamas is the first page, right? Guidelines for supervised
Yes,
financial institution, and we're page 13.
yes, absolutely. Section 6.
13, section 6. My page 13 starts with internal controls, policies, and procedures.
My. Move down until you see section 6. It says, well, a section that says operations of the Board of Directors.
I think she's talking-
Operations.
Which document are you in? Are you in the one with the blue cover? That's
Yeah,
not-
I think
The other
that's
one.
not it.
No,
Which one is it?
the one that says corporate governance, the smaller sheet.
Yeah, the smaller one.
Okay, the one that has the central bank sandal on it.
Yes.
It's 25 pages.
25 pages.
Okay, and
Well,
we're on 13.
Yeah, 13, operations of the board.
Okay, operations of the board of directors.
Mhm.
As stated above, the full board is ultimately responsible for the overall conduct of a license's business affairs. The full board should meet with such frequencies as reflects the complexity, volume of activity, and condition of the license. The board should document its decision as to the frequency of its meetings. However, the central bank may request, based on an examination findings, more frequent meetings of the board. Boards may wish to take advantage of technological advances in modern communication, such as, for example, video conferencing, as this may obviate the need for directors from different jurisdictions to be physically present in the same locale for board meetings. The licenses board should ensure that its meetings are regulated in compliance with the licenses, articles, or bylaws.
I imagine when this was written we didn't think that we'd have this thing called a pandemic, which would make virtual meetings mandatory, not just optional. All right, keep going.
Okay, the board should periodically, no, sorry. Instead of involving a full board every management matter, the full board may choose to supervise major functional areas through specialized committees of the board and/or committees comprising directors and appropriate senior management, while still ensuring that the full board remains fully knowledgeable of the affairs of the licensee and is ultimately responsible for the decision of each committee. The use of such committees should be dictated by the complexity and type of business activities of the licensee. To be effective, such committees should meet regularly as the needs of their particular responsibilities dictate. The board should periodically reconstitute itself and its committees, if any, by selecting new directors to replace longstanding members or those whose contribution to the organization or to the committees is not adequate. In this regard, licensees should have in place a formal and transparent procedure for the appointment of new directors. Committees, when used, should be established with clearly defined objectives, authorities, responsibilities, and tenure, and the requirement that they report regularly to the full board. The board should ensure that the structure of each committee is suitable to the licensee's size and business activity, the board's composition, and each individual's director's expertise. Typical specialized committees that might be considered are described in Apex 2. Particular attention should be given to establishing appropriate methodologies for the board's direct and indirect oversight of the management of significant areas of risk exposure. Example, management of credit risks, liquidity, capital adequacy, compliance, control systems, audits, etc. The central bank recommends that where it is appropriate for the licensee's boards to constitute the following committees, such committees should be composed entirely or predominantly by INEDs. In the absence of other corporate governance protections in the group, such as a group-wide specialized committees whose reports are also being made available to the full board. Given that these committees cover particularly sensitive areas where a potential for conflict of interest exists. A, nomination committee, B, audit committee, and C, compensation committee.
Okay, before you go on, Indira, let me just say that we've talked about committees already, the different types of committees that are out there. The discussion of committees here in this particular paper is very similar, if not identical, to the roles and responsibilities of the committees we've seen. And so you see the essence of committee work and independence keeps coming up, no matter whether it's a general discussion of governance, whether it's an OECD principle discussion, or whether it's a central bank regulatory prescription discussion. It keeps coming up in terms of the importance and responsibilities and the necessary independence that is required by committees. All right, before we go on with Indira, can anybody tell me what INEDS mean? Sorry, not take off the S, INED.
Independent non-executive director.
Okay, so if I would ask that in a definition, everybody should get that one correct. All
What
right.
is it? Independent.
Independent. Okay, what is it, anybody?
Independent non-executive director.
Yeah, independent non-executive director. Okay? Which means that this person should have no affiliation to anybody in that organization. They should not be working there. They should not be married to anybody there. They should not have any kind, they should have no business dealings with anybody there. It has to be independent for them to be effective as far as the central bank and other regulators are concerned. Okay, keep going, Indira. Section 7.
The role of independent non-executive directors. It's right there. Wow. INEDs
The obvious.
are intended to provide checks and balances to ensure that licensees operate in a safe and sound manner and that the interests of the institution are protected. It is considered sound practice for licensees to consider direct reporting for the internal audit function to the board through the audit committee or other structure comprising a majority of independent members. It may be beneficial for INEDs to meet in the absence of bank management at least annually with the external auditor and the heads of the internal audit, compliance, and legal functions. This can strengthen the ability of a bank's board to oversee management's implementation of the board's policy and to ensure that a licensee's business strategies and risk exposures are consistent with risk parameters. A board should regularly reevaluate the mix of skills that it needs to be effective and be willing and able to change its composition accordingly over time. Therefore, rigorous reviews should be undertaken before INEDs who have served for a period of 6 years or more are considered for reappointment or re-election, as the case may be. All directors, including INEDs, are encouraged to make contact with the central bank via the inspector to discuss matters of mutual concern. Further, upon the resignation from the board, all directors, including INEDs, are encouraged to inform the central bank and provide an explanation for the decision, either by way of written correspondence or in person by scheduling a meeting with the inspector.
So you can see then the central bank is continuing to make efforts to control how the boards are being run to make sure that they're sticking to the governance requirements, and that if there's any hanky-panky going on and somebody decides to resign, that hopefully that person might say something that would prompt the central bank to investigate further if there are any problems with the organization. If nothing is wrong and you're just leaving, fine, not a problem. But again, this is all part of what we call the control environment, so that regulators can keep a finger on the pulse of the financial institutions that are operating in the Commonwealth in an effort to make sure that we don't forget our duties and responsibilities as shareholders and directors especially, and senior management persons for all the stakeholders within the financial institutions, especially with regards to the protection of depositors' money. All right, keep going, Indira.
Question before we move
Yes.
on. It's saying that they're encouraged to make contact. If you're leaving the board, you're encouraged. So that's not mandated. You don't have to give a reporting if a board member decides in the middle of his term to resign.
No, it is not mandatory. It is quote unquote merely encouraged.
Okay, no problem,
Yeah.
thanks.
So from a technical perspective, it is not mandatory. From a good practice perspective, it is a good idea. Because if you leave and you don't give an explanation, the central bank is likely to ask you, the rest of the board, the chairman, whomever, senior management, what happened anyway. And then you might say, well, nothing happened. She just decided to resign to go into some other area, and they might leave it alone or not. But no, it is not mandatory. It is only encouraged.
So if
Mhm.
if for case in point the chairman decides that he's stepping down or she's stepping down, is it so we still don't have to report to the
No.
central bank of that
No.
change?
No,
Okay,
you
all
don't
right.
have to. All right, you don't break any regulatory laws if you don't report. It is just considered good practice
Okay,
in
thank
the
you.
current scheme of things, yes, to go ahead and send an explanation to the central bank in writing, or to meet with the inspector and have a discussion about why you're stepping down.
Okay, thank you.
All right, the question. Keep going, Indira.
Requirements for independent non-executive director. An INED is a member of the board who is not materially dependent on the licensee and so not prejudiced in his or her ability to exercise independence of judgment or action. Hence, an INED is a member of the board who is not an officer or employee of the licensee and does not have any business or other relationship which could interfere with the exercise of his or her independent judgment. Licensees should be aware that the central bank places an onus on the board to explain the reasons why it considers a director independent, notwithstanding the existence of relationships or circumstances listed above, which may suggest otherwise. It is important for an INED to be free from any situation that might compromise his or her ability to be objective. Generally, any bank relationship between a licensee and an INED should be conducted at arm's length and under normal commercial terms.
No special favors for your INED of any kind that could possibly compromise their decision making. Okay, keep going.
In particular, please. Close that door. In particular, the following persons are not independent. A, an individual who holds a position of senior official 1 or 2, senior officer 1 or 2 of another licensee. B, an individual who is, or at any time in the past 3 years, was employed by a licensee or a parent or subsidiary of the licensee. C, an individual whose immediate family member is or was employed as an executive officer of the licensee, its parent or subsidiary in the past 3 years. D, an individual who or whose immediate family member has received compensation from the licensee within the past 3 years, with the exception of 1, fees for board or board committee services. 2, payments arising solely from investments in the company's security. 3, compensation paid to an immediate family member who is a non-executive employee of the licensee, its parent or subsidiary. And 4, pensions or other forms of deferred compensation that is for prior service and not contingent upon continued service. E, an individual who or whose immediate family member is a current partner in or a controlling shareholder or executive officer of any organization to which the licensee made or received payments for property or services in the current or in of the past 3 years that exceeds 5% of the recipient's consolidated gross revenue. F, an individual who or whose immediate family member exercises voting control of 5% or more of the shares capital of the licensee. G, an individual who or whose immediate family member is, or at the time during the past 12 months, was a partner or professional employee of an accounting firm engaged as the licensee's external auditor. H, an individual who has obtained a loan from the licensee under special circumstances or condition. I, an individual who has obtained a loan that has fallen into arrears. And J, an individual who represents any shareholder. Licensees should note that the list is not exhaustive and the governor may set additional criteria or grant specific exemptions under special circumstances.
Okay, stick a pin for a second, Indira. Let me just say this. Which governor are we talking about? Is that the governor of the Bahamas?
Central bank governor.
Yeah, the governor of the central bank, which is home, by the way, at the moment. Is it still Wendy Craig?
No.
No. Who is it
Mr.
currently?
Rule?
John Rule.
Yeah,
John Roll.
Yeah, John Roll.
Yeah, John Roll is currently the governor. Who is currently the inspector of banks?
Charles Luttrell.
Yeah, Charles Luttrell. Okay. These names are not necessarily incidental. If you work in a financial services institution, you ought to know them. And if you don't, you ought to get to know them, those names. Notice this list of who is not independent is a pretty long list.
Yes.
So if you are offered a non-independent position and you are involved in any of A through what? J, you have to decline that job. Furthermore, the board should not hire anybody that is known to be in A through J. But we know that that is not necessarily the case. but we hope that they are aware of these requirements. But then people always say they're aware and still do stuff. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to have regular inspections and on-site examinations and a bunch of rules and prescriptive guidelines and all this kind of stuff. Okay? Because folks are well aware, but still do what they do. Keep going, Indira. Disclosure.
Disclosure, when seeking the approval of the central bank for the appointment of an INED, the licensee should clearly state whether in its opinion, the proposed individual meets the test of independence as outlined in these guidelines.
Big test.
Each licensee annual corporate governance certificate should disclose the names of all INEDs. Additionally, the board should certify the INEDs continue to meet the requirements of independence as stated in section, whatever VVI is.
7. Roman numeral 7. I don't blame you.
Of these guidelines. I was gonna guess on that one, but anyway.
Why the hell they didn't put 7 anyway? Like 7.
It's legal, it's legal terms. In the event that a director does not meet requirements, an explanation should be given.
Yes, keep going.
Duties of directors. All directors of the licensee have a duty to perform their functions with diligence and care and with such degree of competence as can reasonably be expected from the persons with their knowledge and experience. All directors of the licensee have a duty to ensure that the risks that they are of necessity undertaken by the licensee in the conduct of its business are managed in a prudent manner. All directors of the licensees have a duty to require that management provide them with adequate, appropriate, and substantive information on the activities and operations of the licensee. All directors of the licensees have the duty to independently assess and question the policies, processes, and procedures of the licensee with the intent to identify and initiate management action on issues requiring improvement. All directors of a licensee should have a basic knowledge and understanding of the conduct of the business of the licensee and the laws, regulations, guidelines, and other regulatory requirements and the customs and practice that govern that business. Although not every director is expected to be fully conversant with every aspect of the business of the licensee, the competence of every director should be commensurate with the nature and scale of the overall business. Directors should work to acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to perform their function on assigned, specialized committees of the board effectively, if such committees are used. All directors, in exercising any authority of the director or discharging any of their duties as a director should, A, act with honesty, integrity, and good faith with a view to do the best interest of the licensee and its clients. B, exercise with care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. C, exercise independent judgment in their approach to decision-making and problem-solving. D, act on a fully informed basis. E, understand and devote sufficient time to their responsibilities. F, act only within the scope of their authority. And G, recognize and guard against conflicts of interest in dealing with the licensee, taking into account the interests of all stakeholders.
Okay, I don't think any of those duties are a surprise to us at this point. It's interesting that even though we brought it over to a prescriptive regulatory requirement, basically the duties of the directors are the same across the board with few exceptions. Okay, something to keep in mind. All right, and then our final discussion, if you're still feeling froggy, and Jerry, you can finish up for us, or you can have somebody else pinch it. What do you want to do?
Sure, I'll go on.
You finish up. Okay, so let's finish up our discussion then on the central bank requirements by looking at some of the key risks that banks and trusts need to take into account in terms of their governance activities, because it's very possible I might ask some short answer questions or definitions for some of these risks because they're very important to the governance work. And how well we understand them and know that they exist will make us better as directors anyway, shareholders and others in doing our governance work. All right, so let's go. Key risks.
Key risks of banks and trust companies. Credit risk. The risk to earnings or capital arising from the potential that a borrower or counterparty will fail to perform on an obligation. Liquidity risk. The risk to earnings or capitals arising from the potential that an organization will be unable to meet its obligation as they come due because of an inability to liquidate assets or obtain adequate funding, or that it cannot easily unwind or offset specific exposures without significantly lowering market prices because of inadequate market depth or market disruption.
Yes. In other
Market
words, if you run out of money and you can't find a way to get it in time to pay your bills, you have a serious liquidity problem, which will lead to a credit risk problem because then whoever you owe money to will not get their payment from you, and everybody is screaming and shouting. Okay, keep going.
Market risk, the risk to earnings or capital resulting from adverse movements in market rates or prices, assessed based on consideration for the interaction between market validity and the organization's business strategy.
Mhm.
Interest rate risk, the risk of earnings or capital resulting from adverse movements in interest rates. Fiduciary risk, the risk of earning and the risk to earnings and capital resulting from a breach of duty in advising on or in holding, administering, managing, or investing the assets of a client or other third party.
In other words, if an investment manager makes poor decisions or fraudulent decisions about investing uh, your assets or the assets of any organization or institution, then they are creating a fiduciary risk because they are not acting in good faith, and therefore it puts your hundreds, thousands, millions, and billions in jeopardy, depending on who is creating that risk. Okay? These are, as you can see, clearly governance issues. Keep going.
Reputation risk, the risk to earnings or capital arising from the potential that negative publicity regarding an organization's business or ethical practices will cause a decline in the customer base, costing litigation or revenue reduction. Such risks often arise from the mismanagement of other risks.
Mhm.
Operational risks, the risk to earnings or capital arising from the potential those inadequate information systems, operational or transactional problems in service and product delivery, breaches in internal controls, fraud, failure to adjust properly to changes in the operating complexities of the market, or unforeseen catastrophes,
Catastrophe.
catastrophes,
Mhm.
I got that,
Yep.
will result in unexpected losses.
Mhm. Keep going.
Settlement risk, the risk to earnings or capital arising when the completion or settlement of a financial transaction fails to take place as expected. Settlement risk is often associated with credit risk, liquidity risk, market risk, operational risk, and reputational risk.
In other words, any risk that it comes about that will not allow an individual or an institution to settle or make payment in accordance to the accordance with the agreement. Okay, keep going.
Technology risk, the risk to earnings or capital arising from inadequate, obsolete, or mismanaged technology, or from a failure or interruption in technology caused by events within or outside the organization. Outsourcing or third-party relationship risk, the risk to earnings or capital arising from a decline in service quality, accuracy, security, or response time on the part of a third party that provides products and services that the organization would otherwise provide for. Compliance risk, the risk to earnings or capital arising from violations or non-compliance with laws, regulations, guidelines, or other regulatory directives, prescribed business practices, or ethical standards. Legal risk, the risk to earnings or capital arising from the potential that unforeseeable, unenforceable contracts, lawsuits, or adverse judgments may disrupt or otherwise negatively affect the operations or financial condition of the organization. People risk, the risk to earnings or capital arising from the inadequacies in the competencies, capabilities, or performance of an organization's personnel, failure to provide for management succession or staff backup, or human error, negligence, or misconduct. Strategic risk, the current and prospective impact on earnings or capital arising from faulty business strategies and decisions, improper implementation of strategies and decisions, or lack of response to industry changes. Country risk, pardon?
And finally,
Country risk and transfer risk. Country or sovereign risk is a risk to earnings and capital arising from the effects on business activities of trends and movements in the economic, social, and political conditions in a country. Country risk is a factor often associated with the evaluation of credit risk. Transfer risk focuses specifically on the availability of foreign exchange to service cross-border obligations.
thank you very much, Indira. Man, it has been a huge night of information. I know this is a lot for you guys to battle with and then prepare for an examination. But remember, part of preparing for an examination is being not only capable of remembering information, but being smart in terms of how you compartmentalize and organize your information and your notes so that you can maximize your response for any type of examination setting. These risks outlined in such detail because these are the various risks that central banks, the Central Bank of the Bahamas considers whenever it comes into a financial institution in the Commonwealth. And if any of these risks or all of them, God forbid, exist in any particular organization, that will not bode well for the governance prospects of that organization and will give the central bank and other regulators a whole lot of cause to write you up and to watch you and to come back and inspect you again soon after until you get everything in place. Not to mention, some of these risks could turn into reputational risk that can cause institutions to be fined and even have their licenses suspended, and in worst case scenarios, revoked. Okay, so none of these risks are to be downplayed. They're all crucial, even right down to country and transfer risk, where we talk about the economic and social and political conditions in the country. If they are not right, they create sovereign risk, and we have problems dealing and interacting with other countries who are looking down on us because they think we have some issue that we can't resolve in those areas. And certainly transfer risk has to do with foreign exchange issues, which was a huge and is a huge problem for us now during the pandemic because we've had to borrow so much money out of the domestic market and foreign market in order to sustain the effects of Dorian and now the pandemic and then the unemployment of so many Bahamians. And so if we were not managing our country risk and our transfer risk well before Dorian and the pandemic, we probably would have been underwater and drowning by now. All right. So the only other thing I want to say, if you scroll down to Appendix 2, Appendix 2 talks about the different committees and their responsibilities. Please read that, know what those committees are. We've seen them before, but still read that bit of information from the Central Bank of the Bahamas in terms of committee requirements, just in case I ask you to, list and describe a couple of committees. You never know, because we know by now that committee work is very important to the governance process. In particular, certain types of committees, all of them are, but we have highlighted a couple that seem to stand out as well. So please take a look at the committee information once again. Make sure that you're ready to take on any questions. Also, I don't know if I told you already, but your examination next week will be electronic. When we meet at 6 o'clock, Miguel will come on and give you a code so that you can go online, pick up your examination, Your answer sheet will be a Word document where you put your answers, and then once you're done, you hit the done button, and the examination and your answers are sent directly to the institute and then to myself for grading. Okay, so that will be the procedure next week. If there are no questions, then I shall see you guys next week, Monday at 6 o'clock, when we will ready ourselves for our midterm examinations. Please, if during your study during the week you have any questions about any aspect of the material, please feel free to send me an email, send me a text, clear it up before your examination next week, Monday. Okay, for sure. Any questions whatsoever? Okay, wonderful. You guys have been fantastic. Good luck with your studies. I am here if you need me to answer any questions that might come up during the next week as you prepare. And please stay safe, and I'll see you next week, Monday at 6 o'clock.
Good night, everyone.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Good night.
Good night.
All right, take care.
Good night.
Good night, take care. See you guys next week.